Hi guys and welcome back. Today is Sketch Tuesday and today I'm actually going to do a tiny little Copic marker illustration which I haven't really played with my Copic markers in a long time as far as anything beyond incorporating colors into very loose sketches. So I wanted this one to be one that felt like a finished piece, and it was a finished piece, but it's actually really tiny. I love artwork like that where it looks very done and complete, but it's in a very, very tiny form. And this one today, I'm working on a 4x6 piece of Fabriano hot press watercolor paper that I cut down. And this paper, I do not like it with watercolor. It's terrible, but I love it with Copic markers. So it's a great reason to make myself get back into using my markers again, because I feel like this paper is perfectly suited for it and not for what I bought it for. So I like having reasons that will like push me into working in stuff like this. The markers, where I've used to use them a ton and I loved them, and watercolor has pretty much completely dominated the type of artwork that I used to do Copic markers with. So having an excuse to get back to that and have more variety in what I am using is always nice. And I actually do really love this paper for Copic marker. Not just that it works for it, so it's an okay thing to use on it. I actually really love it. It feels very similar to Bristol board. If you ever use markers on Bristol board where it's really smooth and it's thick enough to absorb the ink. But this paper in particular is actually thinner than most of the Bristol board that I have used, which means that it doesn't suck up as much of the ink from your pen, your marker that is, which is great because I can still get that blendability that I can on thicker paper, since this is a little bit thicker, but it's not so much that it's like sucking my marker dry and it's making the strokes dry. So yeah, it's great paper for that. I'm really happy with that. And I was always on the hunt for finding the right paper when I was doing a lot of Copic marker drawings, and this one is great for that. And at the very beginning, I was using a light box to lightly transfer the sketch for my sketchbook onto the final paper. I was using a very thin pencil. That's what it is. It's a very thin colored pencil in black. And I love these pencils for doing these light kind of line work because it's a very hard type of lead, so I can get very precise line work, and it's very sharp. It's not like the softer colored pencils where you'll see some of the paper peeking through unless you press really, really hard and then you end up with a thicker line. This pencil is just great at getting a very filled in but thin line, so it's perfect for that. And overall, I did want the look of this piece to be very soft and pastel. I wanted the subject matter itself and this pastel to be almost a juxtaposition. So I was excited about going in a direction that had a very light line work for it. And at the beginning, and I think eventually, I showed the sketch, the original sketch for my sketchbook, a little bit closer. And I do think that I actually prefer the look of his eyes and the overall intensity of that. But I'm beginning to try to make sure that I think in a different way. So a lot of times my final pieces begin as a very rough sketch like this one. And those rough sketches oftentimes have a certain quality that I love about them, but it doesn't quite translate over into the final piece. And I'm trying not to be so negative about it or necessarily look at, I have to fix it, I have to find a way to make it closer to the sketch. I'm trying to look at it more as they are two of their own pieces. The sketch is its sketch, and the final is its own separate thing. And the final, I focus on, okay, what are the qualities that I can get in the final that's different from the sketch? I try to treat it as more in the moment, because I don't want to get stuck there looking at the sketch and the final and thinking, okay, what can I do to make it more like this sketch? I'm looking at, now at least, I'm looking at the final version and thinking, okay, how can I make this final one better than what it is? And I know that's a kind of a small mindset, or a small thing to think about in your mindset, but it has helped me a lot to improve the final version and not get trapped in a thought process of it needs to be exactly like this thing that I've already done, and that it needs to be its own thing, its new thing. And I am just very out of practice with markers. I used to be okay at it when I did it a ton. I don't think that I was ever very masterful at it, especially at knowing when to leave highlights because that is something that I really have struggled with the markers, is understanding how to make sure that I am leaving enough white so that in the future, if I'm blending over it with a whole color to blend it all together, that those areas still stand out as very light. And that's one thing that I tried to do in this piece, and I think that it was pretty successful. I left an area of his forehead and his nose white so that when I blended the entirety of his skin together, which I knew that I was going to, it would be the lighter value and it would stand out without being white anymore. And his skin, I did want it to be very multicolored. I wanted a lot of pastel colors coming in, and so it almost looked opally. But I did have a few colors that I had already picked out that I had tested together, and I knew I liked how they looked, and they had a similar saturation and softness to them. And that was really helpful to have a little body of colors to pull from and to grab for. I did try to do the shadows in a color that I would normally do in Photoshop. So I usually like to shade skin with purple. I think it looks great. It looks very deep of a shadow and it creates these really beautiful colors together. So I did go in with a purple for the shadow on his skin and then with a blue to deepen up some of the areas. And it was about this point where I decided to try putting in that violet that I put over all of his skin to harmonize it into the highlight of his hair to blend those two together. And that was definitely not the right choice. It was far too different from the hair itself, so it looked really strange. So I did end up going back over that highlight with a lighter version of his hair, this turquoisey color, which is actually pretty great. I mean, I liked how it ended up turning out, and I like that the markers aren't so set in stone that once I put one thing down, I can never change it. It's just very similar actually to watercolor, where you can layer colors to get the final result that you want. So I knew that when I put that really light violet down, I knew that it wasn't something that if it didn't work, there was no way to come back from it. So that allowed me to experiment with it and to see how it looked. So if I knew that it was no way going to be something I could cover or change or manipulate, I wouldn't have done it necessarily, or I would have tried it on a scratch piece of paper more. But because I knew how it handled and how I could layer with Copic markers, I knew that I would be able to cover that up if it didn't work, which it didn't. So it's really good to get a grasp of how things layer with what you're using, like this or with watercolor, to know how much you can cover up and what values you can use to cover up other values. So that's just really helpful when you're using markers like this, is that there's a lot that you can change and cover and add to. So I want to make sure that I'm not thinking so set in stone, or that I'm not necessarily pushing things too far either, that I'm aware of the limitations of the markers. And this part is one of my favorite parts of the piece, where I'm giving him some silver blood. I love this paint set. I highly recommend it. It's the Cintiq mica gold, maybe. I'll have a link to it in the description and to everything else that I used for this piece, actually. But I love this stuff. You do have to activate it with a few drops of water before you use it, a couple minutes before, so that it has that really creamy, opaque consistency. But I really love it. And I did end up choosing the silver because it was very desaturated, and I wanted something that wasn't going to compete with the rest of the piece for colors. So if I went in with one of those really saturated golds, it would overpower it immediately. And after the paint dried, I went in with my micron pen just to add a little bit more dimension to the silver blood that's dripping down his chest, and also to balance it out with his eyes, since I had silver and black for his pupils. I just look for things like that I can do to balance out a piece. And that's it for today's Sketch Tuesday. I enjoyed working on him, so that's always nice, but I will actually have the original available at my shop, so if you wanted to own him, I'll have a link down in the description as well as in my end card. And he is 4x6, so he does fit in a 4x6 frame pretty nicely, but yes, he is available. And that is pretty much it for today. So I do post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, so if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, and if you have subscribed and haven't hit that bell yet, hit that and you can get notifications on when I post. But yeah, that is everything. So I'll see you guys on my next video.